Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a journey into one of the most unsettling true crime cases in modern Russia. Tonight, we explore the life and crimes of Radik Tagirov, better known by the media as the Volga Maniac. Over the course of several years, an alarming string of murders took place in seemingly ordinary neighborhoods along the Volga River, targeting elderly women who lived alone and often had no one to turn to in their final moments. Nothing. The brutality of these crimes was matched only by their apparent randomness, leaving both law enforcement and the public overwhelmed with fear and uncertainty. For nearly a decade, Tagirov managed to slip through the fingers of detectives in multiple cities, confounding investigative teams that struggled to connect the dots. Each time the authorities believed they were onto something, he vanished again, leaving behind only haunting echoes of his violence. Nothing. Yet with time, and thanks to the dedication of countless individuals, this elusive killer's identity was finally laid bare. In the chapters ahead, we'll walk through the darkest corridors of his twisted life, examining every clue, missed opportunity, and stroke of insight that led to his capture. Make sure you stay with us until the end, because once you step into this world, you'll see just how fragile the line between safety and terror can be. Part 2. The crime journey roots in a changing Russia. To grasp the magnitude of Radik Tagirov's crimes, one must begin with the backdrop of Russia's sweeping changes in the late 20th century. Born in 1971 in Kazan, a historically significant city where the Volga and Kazanka rivers meet, Tagirov came into a world teetering on the edge of transformation. The Soviet Union was still officially intact, but signs of decay were everywhere. Economic strains, political tensions, and an unsettled social climate set the stage for a generation of youth growing up amid uncertainty. Kazan, often called the third capital of Russia, is a city that embodies the dualities of Russian culture. Its skyline blends the towering minarets of mosques with the gold onion domes of Orthodox cathedrals, reflecting centuries of Tatar and Russian coexistence. By the time Tagirov was in his teens, however, the city was beset by shifting economic realities. Factories that once employed thousands faced closures or restructuring. Organized crime stepped in to fill the vacuum, recruiting disillusioned young men looking for quick money and a sense of belonging. In this milieu, Tagirov grew up in a family of modest means. Neither parent had advanced education. They worked in local industries whose futures were increasingly precarious. The household environment was reportedly tense, with frequent arguments about finances. While there is no clear evidence that he suffered from overt physical abuse, relatives hinted that emotional neglect was not uncommon. As an only child, some say he might have had half siblings from his father's earlier relationships, though records are unclear. Tagirov often found himself alone, both at home and in social settings. Even in childhood, Tagirov's teachers noted a duality in his demeanor. He could be polite and compliant, especially if it served some immediate interest, but also displayed flashes of anger or cruelty. Bullying incidents at school were rumored. Nothing severe enough to draw significant disciplinary action, yet telling in retrospect. This was a young boy who learned early how to manipulate social rules to his advantage while nursing an inner reservoir of resentment. By the late 1980s, as the Soviet Union began its final collapse, Kazan was awash in economic confusion. Lines for basic goods stretched for blocks, and the black market thrived. For the teenage Tagirov, this was a world of potential opportunity. Rules were hazy, enforcement was lax, and unscrupulous activities could be masked by the larger chaos. While many youths were drawn to petty crime as a means of survival or rebellion, most did not evolve into violent criminals. Yet for Tagirov, these conditions formed the crucible in which nascent antisocial tendencies were allowed to ferment. Troubled adolescence and first brushes with crime. Around age 15, Tagirov dropped out of formal schooling altogether. Official records don't specify the exact reasons, but acquaintances believe it was partially due to poor academic performance and a lack of family support. He drifted toward unskilled labor, market stalls, loading docks, occasional construction sites, never holding a position for more than a few months. Money was meager, satisfaction even less so. Around this time, rumors of his small-scale thefts began circulating in the local neighborhoods. Items would go missing from unlocked cars or petty cash from the back rooms of shops. Nothing. Though these incidents never escalated into high-profile cases, they were enough to put him on the radar of Kazan's overburdened police force. Records indicate that Tagirov was questioned a few times in connection with thefts, but no formal charges stuck. In the eyes of the law, he was a petty delinquent, one among many in the turbulent city. Yet beneath the surface, Tagirov's worldview was hardening. People who knew him then described him as harboring a simmering anger towards society. He felt cheated, no stable job, no real prospects, and no path out of poverty. This personal resentment, fueled by the breakdown of social structures around him, seemed to mutate into a distorted sense of entitlement. Where others saw vulnerability or hardship, Tagirov saw targets. His petty thefts also provided a form of low-stakes thrill, testing the boundaries of what he could get away with. A chilling anecdote from a friend at the time highlights the callousness that would come to define him. The friend recounted a day when they watched an elderly woman struggle with her grocery bags. While most people might offer help or at least ignore the situation, Tagirov muttered a cruel remark about how easy it would be to rob someone so weak and alone. The comment was brushed off as a dark joke, but in hindsight, it was a window into a mind that viewed vulnerability as an invitation for predation. The early 1990s transitioned to greater risks. With the Soviet Union officially dissolved in 1991, the newly formed Russian Federation faced an uncertain future. Economic shock therapy policies led to rapid inflation, widespread privatization, and the erosion of many social safety nets. Organized crime burgeoned, controlling everything from street markets to entire factories. While Tagirov never rose to any significant rank within these criminal hierarchies, he learned from the environment around him, particularly how to evade the law and exploit the system's cracks. In the early 1990s, he began moving around the Volga region. Some stints placed him in Samara, another major city along the river known for its aerospace and automotive industries. Other times, he ventured to Leonovsk or Saratov, always in search of temporary jobs. This migratory pattern served a dual function. It provided him with a modicum of income while keeping police from pinpointing his whereabouts. During these relocations, Tagirov's criminal activities escalated beyond petty theft. Police reports from multiple cities mention a suspect matching his description, who targeted isolated residences, often belonging to older individuals living alone. Break-ins were typically non-violent in this period. He would slip away with modest valuables, small electronics, jewelry, and cash. Yet investigators noticed that the burglar sometimes went through personal items in what appeared to be an act of spite or curiosity. No immediate links were made, as different jurisdictions handled the cases independently, and the timeline of forensic database sharing was still in its infancy. Friends and acquaintances from these years described him as elusive. He had a knack for blending into various social circles, from day laborers to bar patrons, without leaving a lasting impression. He rarely stayed in one place for more than a few months, meaning that by the time local suspicions arose, he had already departed for another city. It was a nomadic existence, but one that suited his growing penchant for criminality. Seeds of violence, from burglary to physical threats, the line between property crimes and violent crimes is not always clearly delineated. For some offenders, the shift is abrupt, triggered by a perceived threat or moment of panic. For others, like Tagirov, it appears almost inevitable, a slow, calculated progression toward more dangerous offenses. In the mid-1990s, several older residents in Kazan and Samara reported break-ins that involved intimidation. While not all cases were conclusively linked to Tagirov, the modus operandi bore similarities. Nothing. The burglar seemed to know that the occupant was elderly and alone. He would threaten them verbally to reveal valuables or PN codes, occasionally resorting to rough force. Victims who survived these encounters noted a cold, almost mechanical approach. He demanded compliance swiftly, and if they hesitated, he inflicted minimal but deliberate harm, enough to convey that he meant business. Some criminologists later argued that these incidents were a crucible, a test of how far Tagirov could push his victims without attracting the heightened attention that comes with homicide. If so, it was a twisted form of escalation, one step closer to the ultimate crime. However, the lack of a centralized database and the stigma older victims sometimes felt about reporting assaults meant that many such cases went unreported or remained unconnected to the emerging serial perpetrator. Still, these early violent incidents illuminated a critical aspect of Tagirov's psyche, a desire for control and dominance, coupled with a chilling willingness to impose suffering on the vulnerable. Once he realized the relative ease with which he could overpower or terrorize an elderly individual, the psychological barrier to more lethal acts eroded further. The 2000s, laying the ground for serial offenses. By the early 2000s, Russia had entered a new era under President Vladimir Putin, marked by a certain degree of political stability and an upturn in the economy, at least on paper. While some segments of society prospered, others languished, especially pensioners and those in peripheral regions. Social safety nets, though improved from the chaotic 1990s, still left many elderly citizens in precarious circumstances. This backdrop proved to be the dark canvas on which Tagirov would paint his most horrifying deeds. He had accumulated enough experience: burglaries, intimidation, minor run-ins with the law, to know both the potential rewards and pitfalls of his chosen criminal path. He was now in his late 20s or early 30s, well past the age of impulsive teenage delinquency. Yet he had never developed the social or professional grounding that might steer him away from crime. Instead, he seemed to refine his tactics, perfecting the art of blending in and capitalizing on older individuals' isolation. Detectives who later reviewed this period found scattered evidence that Tagirov was responsible for multiple burglaries across at least 4 cities. What they couldn't prove conclusively at the time was that these crimes were committed by the same person, as he used no consistent moniker, left minimal forensic traces, and selected his targets opportunistically. Nonetheless, a few hallmark signatures appeared repeatedly. No forced entry. Whenever possible, he gained access by tricking the victim into letting him in, posing as a maintenance worker, a distant relative, or someone in need of help. Brief but aggressive confrontations. If discovered or challenged, he used threats or mild force to subdue his victim quickly, but rarely escalated to lethal violence in this stage. Selective theft. He favored items that could be sold easily. Jewelry, small electronics, cash. He was less interested in large or traceable objects. Meticulous escapee. He planned exits carefully, often scoping out the building layout, nearby public transport options, and neighbor routines beforehand. At the time, many of his victims were too frightened or ashamed to provide detailed testimonies. Some older individuals even doubted the police would bother investigating their cases, given the volume of more serious crimes in those cities. Thus, nothing. Tagirov continued his streak with a relatively low risk of detection, owning the predatory instincts that would soon explode into a full-blown spree of violence. The first confirmed murder, a grim turn. While speculation persists that Tagirov may have committed murder prior to 2011, the first officially confirmed homicide attributed to him occurred that year in Kazan. The victim was an elderly woman, living alone in a small apartment near a bustling street market. Police reports indicate that she was found strangled, and the apartment showed signs of ransacking. Neighbors could not recall hearing screams or disturbances, suggesting a swift, silent attack. This case marked a pivotal escalation. Up until then, despite violent tendencies, Tagirov seemed to avoid murder, possibly to reduce the investigative pressure that accompanies homicide. So why cross that line? Criminologists offer several theories. Witness elimination. The victim may have recognized him, or he feared she could identify him to police. Deepening desensitization. Years of intimidation and low-level violence may have eroded any remaining barriers to lethal force. Psychological compulsion. Some serial killers describe a rush or compulsion that drives them to kill rather than merely threaten. From this point on, the level of brutality increased. Over the next few months, nothing. More elderly women in Kazan were found dead in similar circumstances, each strangled in their own homes. Valuables were missing, but the degree of violence seemed disproportionate to mere theft. Nothing. Fear rippled through the community, especially among seniors who lived alone, and rumors circulated about a mysterious intruder who gained entry under false pretenses. Yet, local police were not entirely certain they were dealing with a single perpetrator. While investigators recognized similarities in the crimes, they had little precedent for such a spree. What they needed was a forensic link, DNA, fingerprints, or a consistent pattern of behavior, strong enough to unify the cases under one suspect. For the moment, they worked in the dark, trying to piece together scattered clues as the body count rose. The spread to other Volga cities in the latter half of 2011 and into 2012. Similar murders began cropping up in other Volga cities, including Samara, Saratov-Ulyanovsk, and eventually even farther downriver. Each followed a chillingly similar script. An elderly female victim, living alone, was found strangled, with small valuables missing. Neighboring regions' police departments initially viewed these cases as isolated incidents, unaware of the parallel investigations unfolding in Kazan and other areas. What made Tagirov so elusive was his mobility. He used trains, buses, and occasionally hitchhiked between cities. He kept to a transient lifestyle, staying in cheap rentals or short-term accommodations where identification checks were lax. The Volga region's extensive transportation network, designed to facilitate commerce and travel, unintentionally provided a perfect route for a roaming predator. An important detail emerged in at least 2 cases. The victims had mentioned to a neighbor or friend that a courteous handyman or service worker had stopped by earlier in the week. These fleeting remarks suggested Tagirov's reliance on impersonation. By appearing helpful, well-mannered, and unthreatening, he gained entry without raising suspicion. Once inside, he would strike quickly, often using any ligature he found: a belt, a scarf, an electrical cord. The effect on local populations was immediate and profound. Elderly citizens, already vulnerable, began barricading their doors or refusing to answer knocks altogether. In some housing blocks, neighbors set up informal watch committees, yet the murders continued. Residents grew increasingly frustrated with law enforcement, demanding a coordinated response that was slow to materialize due to bureaucratic hurdles and jurisdictional boundaries. Heightened fear and media coverage. By mid-2012, rumors of a Volga maniac started to spread in local newspapers and television broadcasts. Sensational headlines stoked public panic. Who is targeting our grandmothers? Or, maniac on the move, another elderly victim found. These stories, while raising awareness, also incited a degree of paranoia. Senior citizens in multiple cities reported instances of suspicious individuals knocking on their doors and quickly leaving when questioned. Police hotlines were inundated with leads, many of them false or inconclusive. The media attention also complicated matters for Tagirov. Investigators suspect he closely followed news coverage, adjusting his approach to avoid detection. For instance, whenever a local station reported that residents should beware of suspicious utility workers, Tagirov might switch to posing as a lost relative or a volunteer from a pension fund. This chameleon, like adaptability, became a hallmark of his modus operandi. At this stage, the scale of the killings remained difficult to quantify. Some cases were definitively linked by DNA or distinctive patterns, while others remained in investigative limbo. Families of victims demanded answers, appearing on talk shows and writing open letters to authorities. The scattered, cross-regional nature of the murders meant that no single police department had the complete picture, until a partial DNA match emerged that indicated the same unknown male suspect was behind multiple crimes. This revelation marked the beginning of a more formal, unified investigation, though the road to capturing Tagirov would remain fraught with challenges for years to come. The interlude, periods of dormancy. Serial killers often exhibit cyclical behavior, periods of heightened activity followed by lulls. Tagirov was no exception. Investigators noted that the pattern of murders seemed to come in waves. After several quick strikes in different cities, there might be a stretch of weeks or even months with no reported homicides fitting the same profile. The reasons behind these dormant periods are speculative. Some experts propose that Tagirov might have temporarily returned to a semblance of a normal life, taking odd jobs, lying low to avoid drawing attention. Others theorize that he used these intervals to relocate or scout new hunting grounds. Still others suggest that internal psychological factors, fears of capture, or a need to cool off, could have caused him to pause before resuming his lethal spree. During these quieter intervals, police efforts often lost momentum. Budget constraints, shifting priorities, and the constant influx of other serious crimes meant task forces were disbanded or reassigned. Each time Tagirov resurfaced, it reignited the sense of urgency, but also highlighted how easily the trail could grow cold in between killings. The tally of victims and ongoing speculation. By 2013, investigators in multiple cities tentatively linked over a dozen murders to the same elusive killer. Some forensic specialists believe the true number was much higher, possibly more than 20. Confirmations were often hampered by incomplete DNA evidence, limited witness accounts, and the advanced age of many potential victims, some of whom passed away from natural causes before they could give statements. Local communities were plagued by uncertainty. People asked, could my neighbor's death have been the work of this maniac? Or, did the older lady who died last month actually fall victim to a burglar? Disentangling ordinary mortality from homicidal incidents among the elder required meticulous autopsies that local municipalities equipped investigations, and local municipalities handle at scale. Meanwhile, misinformation flourished. Some tabloids claimed the Volga maniac was a retired soldier with PTSD, while others blamed a satanic cult. Each rumor forced investigators to expend resources chasing baseless leads. In the chaos, Tagirov continued to claim more lives, slipping ever deeper into the shadows. The sense of a ticking clock hovered over the entire region. The longer he remained at large, the more ingrained his methods became, and the more brazen he seemed to grow. Yet, unbeknownst to Tagirov, law enforcement was slowly adapting to, implementing better data sharing procedures, advancing DNA profiling techniques, and coordinating across regional boundaries in ways that would eventually corner him. By the time the public began to refer to the killer simply as the Volga maniac, it was clear that this was no ordinary criminal. His reign of terror seemed unstoppable, and the next few years would prove pivotal in shaping both the investigation and the psychological cat and mouse game he played with the authorities. Part 3T. Nothing. The process of capturing the criminal, early investigations, and the lack of coordination. The murders tied to the Volga maniac spanned numerous cities and towns, each governed by its own local police force. Although Russia does maintain national oversight through the Ministry of Internal Affairs, practical coordination across such a vast territory can be cumbersome. Investigative leads that might have helped crack the case sooner were often lost in bureaucratic shuffle or delayed by slow information exchange between precincts. In Kazan, detectives were the first to suspect a serial killer, given their cluster of similar cases. They tried to reach out to counterparts in Samara and Saratov, who were investigating murders that bore the same hallmarks. However, official collaboration required reams of paperwork, and local units had limited staff to dedicate solely to a multi-region search. Thus, the early 2010s were marked by disjointed efforts, a regional jigsaw puzzle missing crucial pieces. Forming a joint task force as the body count mounted, public pressure and media scrutiny forced a more unified response. By late 2012, an inter-regional task force was assembled under the auspices of higher-level authorities. This team drew experienced detectives, forensic analysts, and criminal profilers from several cities along the Volga. Their mandate to treat these homicides as part of a single investigation, pooling resources and intelligence to identify patterns that might lead to the killer. Key elements of the Joint Task Force's strategy: centralized database, nothing. They established a centralized digital database where local police could upload new homicide details, including forensic evidence and witness statements, in real time. DNA matching. A specialized lab was tasked with cross-referencing all available DNA samples from relevant crime scenes, ensuring the data was consistently updated and shared. Victim profiling. Behavioral analysts profiled the victims, focusing on their living situations, routines, and social networks in an attempt to figure out how the killers selected them. Suspect mapping. Every known offender in the region with a history of burglary or violence against elderly individuals was flagged. This massive list of names was then cross-checked against travel records and city migration logs. For the first time, a comprehensive picture began to emerge of a single individual who traversed the Volga region, leaving a macabre signature wherever he went. Yet, even with this concerted effort, the killer remained an enigma. Investigators had no luck matching the partial DNA from the crime scenes with profiles in the National Criminal Database. That strongly suggested someone who either had never committed a major crime or had effectively evaded the law whenever he did. Behavioral analysis. Profiling the Volga maniac, one of the most critical components of the investigation, was the work of behavioral profilers, who drew on methodologies pioneered by FBI analysts in the United States and adapted them to the Russian context. They concluded that the killer likely had a background in low-level crime or had spent considerable time on the margins of society, displayed a manipulative edge, using deception to gain entry into victims' homes, demonstrated some knowledge of police procedures, indicating he followed news coverage or had learned from prior brushes with the law, might have a fragmented living situation, shifting accommodations, part-time jobs, or an itinerant lifestyle that allowed him to relocate quickly. These insights helped narrow the suspect pool, but not enough to produce a single name. The next big step was the assimilation of advanced forensic techniques, especially familial DNA searches, which were slowly gaining traction within certain Russian law enforcement circles. near misses and red herrings between 2013 and 2015, a string of near misses almost ended Tagirov's spree. In several instances, neighbors spotted a suspicious man leaving a crime scene shortly after a murder. The descriptions always varied. Some said he wore a baseball cap, others claimed he had a toolbox. One eyewitness provided enough detail for a composite sketch. While not an exact likeness, the profile bore a passing resemblance to Tagirov. Yet, the region-wide population was so large that the composite alone was insufficient for identification. To complicate matters, the task force encountered numerous false leads. Psychics, unscrupulous informants, and attention seekers flooded hotlines with tips. Some individuals were arrested on suspicion of being the Volga maniac, only to be released after DNA tests ruled them out. In one case, an ex-convict with a history of assault on an elderly woman was interrogated for weeks. Investigators were convinced they had found the right man, only to discover that his DNA did not match evidence from any of the murder scenes. These red herrings strained already limited resources and tested the morale of the investigative teams. Public sentiment oscillated between anger at perceived police incompetence and sympathy for the daunting complexity of the case. Each missed opportunity ratcheted up the pressure, as local politicians and media demanded justice, while older citizens lived in perpetual fear. Forensic innovations. The game changer, a turning point arrived around 2018 with the increasing effectiveness of genealogical DNA matching, a method by which partial matches can be used to identify relatives of an unknown suspect. Although such techniques were still in early adoption phases in Russia, the task force managed to partner with a specialized lab capable of advanced analysis. Using the genetic markers found at multiple crime scenes, they combed through genealogical databases that held voluntary submissions of DNA from individuals tracing their ancestry. This approach yielded a partial match to a distant relative, which, through additional investigation, directed the task force to focus on a few extended families in Tatarstan. Among the possible candidates was a name that eventually stood out: Radik Tagirov. Initially arrested for minor thefts in the 1990s, he had avoided major felony convictions, explaining why his profile did not surface in standard criminal databases. Surveillance and the Long Watch, armed with a name and a tenuous link, investigators commenced covert surveillance on Tagirov. Detectives observed his daily routines, the locations he frequented, and any individuals he associated with. Over time, patterns emerged. He was known to do odd jobs, often for elderly clients who needed repairs or help moving items. He also made intermittent trips to nearby cities, never staying long in one place. This extensive watch required rotating teams to avoid spooking the suspect. Officers dressed in plain clothes and vehicles were swapped out frequently. The environment was high stakes. If Tagirov caught wind of the investigation, he could vanish again for months or even years. He had done so in the past, and the task force was determined not to lose him this time. Additional clues bolstered the case of phone records placed Tagirov near the sites of several murders. He frequently disposed of SIM cards, a tactic criminals often use to avoid digital trails. But forensic specialists managed to piece together enough location data to show a strong correlation. Investigators also analyzed his social media, although he had minimal presence, and financial transactions, noting that he sometimes pawned jewelry that could have belonged to the victims. Planning the arrest by late 2020, the task force was confident they had enough evidence: DNA, circumstantial links, and behavioral patterns to make an arrest. However, they also knew that any misstep could jeopardize the operation. The plan was to apprehend Tagirov in a controlled environment, minimizing the chance for violence or escape. After weeks of careful monitoring, they identified a predictable routine: early morning grocery runs and occasional construction site visits. on December 1, 2020, at approximately 6:00 a.m. A group of plainclothes officers parked near Tagirov's small apartment on the outskirts of Kazan. Another team waited in unmarked cars near his most frequented bus stop. Shortly before sunrise, Tagirov emerged carrying a worn backpack. As he walked down the street, officers calmly approached, presented their badges, and ordered him to surrender. Initially startled, Tagirov attempted to retreat but found himself surrounded. In under a minute, he was in handcuffs, the long manhunt finally at its end. Interrogations and confessions once in custody. Tagirov was taken to a secure facility for questioning. The interrogation transcripts paint a disturbing picture. During the initial sessions, he denied everything, claiming he had never even heard of the Volga maniac. However, the weight of evidence was overwhelming. Confronted with DNA matches, phone records, and eyewitness accounts, Tagirov's demeanor shifted from defiance to a detached sort of resignation. He began providing details about certain murders, details that only the perpetrator could know. His recollections were chillingly precise. Tagirov explained how he selected victims by observing which apartments were occupied by single, elderly residents, how he would knock and introduce himself as a service technician, and how quickly he would strike once inside. He justified the thefts as a means to survive financially but faltered when asked to explain the necessity of murder. At times, he would respond with a flat, "They saw my face," or simply shrug, suggesting a callous lack of remorse. Throughout the interrogation process, psychologists and profilers were brought in to assess Tagirov's mental state. Their evaluations largely confirmed earlier hypotheses: a manipulative individual with deep, seated antisocial traits, an almost complete absence of empathy, and a predatory sense of superiority over his victims. While he did not openly revel in the violence, neither did he exhibit genuine regret. Public reaction and official statements. As news of the arrest broke, the Russian media erupted with coverage. Headlines announced the capture of the Volga maniac, and community members finally exhaled a collective sigh of relief. Interviews with victims' families revealed a mixture of anger and sorrow, coupled with a measure of gratitude that the killer was now off the streets. Police officials and political figures who had been under scrutiny for years were quick to hold press conferences, detailing the complexity of the operation and praising the perseverance of the task force. Some critics argued that the arrest came too late, citing the many lives lost and the bureaucratic delays that hindered earlier solutions. Still, the prevailing sentiment was that justice had at last caught up with the elusive predator. In Kazan, Samara, Saratov, and other cities affected by the murders, small memorials were set up in honor of the victims. Community leaders promised better outreach programs for the elderly, urging families and neighbors to remain vigilant. While the sense of relief was palpable, the shadow of the crimes lingered, particularly for those who had lost loved ones to Tagirov's brutality. Part 4. Psychological analysis, antisocial personality traits, and psychopathy. And one of the most common frameworks for understanding serial killers is the concept of psychopathy. Characterized by a lack of empathy, superficial charm, manipulative behavior, and egocentricity. While not every serial murderer meets the clinical threshold for psychopathy, Tagirov exhibited many of these traits. Manipulative charm. He was adept at convincing elderly victims to trust him, whether by posing as a friendly handyman or a concerned citizen. Absence of empathy. His interrogation statements and behavioral patterns revealed an inability to grasp or care about the pain he inflicted. Grandiose self-perception. Evading police for nearly a decade likely reinforced a belief in his own cleverness. Impulsivity coupled with calculation. Though some murders appeared opportunistic, the overall pattern suggested careful premeditation, e.g., scouting apartments, monitoring neighbors, and planning escape routes. Criminal psychologists note that such individuals often maintain a veneer of normalcy in everyday life, which allows them to slip under the radar. Tagirov's ability to hold odd jobs, move between cities, and avoid major altercations exemplifies this dual existence. A seemingly unremarkable drifter on the surface, harboring lethal intentions behind closed doors. Evolution from petty crimes to serial homicide. Understanding Tagirov's escalation requires examining both internal predispositions and external stimuli. His early involvement in theft and burglary provided low-level criminal training. He learned how to surveil potential targets, defeat basic security measures, and avoid leaving evidence. Over time, these skills, combined with a specific psychological bent, paved the way for violence. A parallel can be drawn to the graduation hypothesis in criminology, where repeated success in lower-level offenses builds confidence in an offender. Tagirov's repeated ability to evade capture, even when suspected of more serious assaults, likely emboldened him to escalate to murder. Add to this the relative vulnerability of elderly victims, physically weaker, often isolated, and one sees how the threshold for violence became dangerously easy to cross. Motivational complexity: robbery, thrill, or control. The question of motive in serial homicide is rarely straightforward. While Tagirov did steal valuables from his victims, the severity of his violence exceeded what was necessary for a simple robbery. Why strangle an elderly woman who posed little threat? Several forensic psychiatrists propose that Tagirov's actions were driven by a need to exert total control. Strangulation, a direct and intimate form of killing, provided a sense of dominance. Others argue that he might have harbored subconscious rage, potentially originating from a deeply dysfunctional upbringing. Finding an outlet in the easiest targets available, the murders became a twisted intersection of pragmatic theft and sadistic compulsion. Additionally, the intangible thrill factor must be considered. Some serial offenders describe a rush or sense of omnipotence they derive from successfully executing a crime and outwitting law enforcement. While Tagirov did not openly flaunt his crimes, his repeated pattern of returning to the same modus operandi suggests a compulsion beyond mere financial gain. Social alienation and lack of stable identity. Another dimension is Tagirov's near total lack of stable social ties. He never married, had no close friendships, and drifted from one transient living situation to another. This rootlessness is often associated with higher risk for chronic offending, as the offender is not anchored by family, steady employment, or community relationships. The absence of such personal connections means fewer opportunities for intervention. No one is checking in, noticing changes in behavior, or urging the person to seek help. This isolation also fed into Tagirov's emotional detachment. Psychologists who evaluated him post-arrest noted a profound sense of disconnection from societal norms. He viewed most human interactions as purely transactional, a mindset that, while it might have begun as a coping mechanism for a chaotic upbringing, mutated into a justification for predatory acts. The role of opportunity and societal neglect. It's important to place Tagirov's crimes in the broader societal context of the Volga region. Many of his victims lived in aging apartment blocks with minimal security, located in neighborhoods where no longer knew each other well. Some had outlived spouses and children, leaving them particularly isolated. Economic strains meant that local authorities were slow to implement safety measures like secure entry systems or regular patrols. These societal shortcomings created a perfect storm of opportunity. Combined with Tagirov's predator mindset, the environment essentially offered him a large pool of vulnerable potential victims and minimal immediate deterrence. Even after the killings began, the slow enter, Regional coordination allowed him to keep moving and avoid detection. Post-arrest evaluation and criminal responsibility. Following his apprehension, Tagirov underwent psychiatric evaluations to assess his criminal responsibility. While he exhibited strong antisocial traits, evaluators found him competent to stand trial. There was no evidence of psychosis or mental disorder severe enough to impair his grasp of reality. Rather, his actions appeared calculated, driven by a cold, rational pursuit of power and gain. The distinction between madness and malevolence is key here. Tagirov did not claim voices told him to kill, nor did he demonstrate disorganized thinking. He simply lacked moral restraint and empathy. Legally, this meant he was fully accountable for his choices that inflicted immeasurable harm on unsuspecting victims and their families. Reflections on serial offending. When society confronts a serial killer like Tagirov, it grapples with the dark reality that such crimes can occur anywhere vulnerabilities exist. The Volga maniac cases underscores themes common to many serial offenses: a capable but morally bankrupt individual, a pool of vulnerable victims, and institutional gaps that slow the investigative response. While not all criminals share Tagirov's specific profile, the interplay of personal psychology and environmental opportunity is often the linchpin that enables serial offenses to flourish. In dissecting his psychology, experts hope to glean insights that may aid future prevention efforts, whether by training social workers to spot warning signs in troubled youth, improving community outreach to isolated seniors, or enhancing cross-regional policing. Yet perhaps the most haunting realization is that no single measure can guarantee perfect safety. The mind that chooses to exploit society's weakest often finds a way, until it is finally caught. Part 5. The End, the saga of Radik Tagirov, once known only as the Volga maniac, reminds us how a single individual, fueled by callous intent, can inflict profound fear and suffering on unsuspecting communities. For years, Tagirov roamed from city to city, seeking out the most vulnerable among us elderly women living alone, often forgotten by a society preoccupied with its own challenges. By posing as a helping hand, he gained their trust long enough to commit unspeakable acts of violence. Yet, in the end, determination and innovation prevailed. Multiple police forces, once hampered by bureaucratic obstacles, united around a common purpose. Forensic scientists pushed the boundaries of technology, finally isolating the crucial DNA links. Investigators on the ground invested endless hours surveilling a man who, for so long, had viewed himself as untouchable. Their collective efforts culminated in his arrest, offering a sense of justice, albeit one that can never truly mend the pain of those left behind. Today, Tagirov serves a life sentence in a high-security facility, a tangible reminder of the thin line separating everyday life from hidden horror. The lessons of this case resonate far beyond the Volga region. They underscore the importance of community vigilance, the power of collaboration across jurisdictions, and the urgent need to protect those among us who are most at risk. Above all, they stand as a testament to human resilience in the face of evil. If you found this story compelling or have thoughts on how to prevent similar tragedies, please share them below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more in-depth explorations of real-life cases where the boundary between safety and terror is razor thin. Together, we can remain vigilant, informed, and committed to safeguarding our communities from the shadows that sometimes lurk just beyond our doorsteps.